Good evening, and thank you for attending our community conversation. My name is Kevin Marriott, Assistant Director for Professional Learning, and I have the honor of introducing tonight's guest speaker, Zaque Evans. Zaque was born and raised in Penfield. A PHS class of 2009 graduate, Zaque was involved with a variety of activities in the Penfield community. He served as a class president for all 4 years at PHS, played football, and was a host, director, and producer of the morning announcements and other media productions. He was an active member of the drama program, and he was also the announcer of the Penfield varsity baseball. Since graduating the University at Buffalo in 2013 and settling in Buffalo, Zaque has worked in broadcasting as a producer for a national talk radio show, a promotions manager, an on-air personality, and a pregame reporter for the Buffalo Bills radio network. Currently, Zaque wears 2 main hats. In his day-to-day life, he is a senior policy specialist for the government of Erie County, New York, working on issues such as affordable housing, childcare, workforce development, and poverty reduction. His other main hat is that of a PhD candidate at the University at Buffalo, where he is also an adjunct instructor and recipient of the Adeline G. Levine Excellence in Teaching Award and the university's Graduate Excellence in Teaching Award. His graduate training is in sociology, applied research, and data analytics. Please join me in welcoming Zaque Evans to the stage.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I know some of you I gave many ulcers to over my course of 4 years at PHS, so I appreciate you coming if I was one of those people that did that. This, real quick, we left a table there with cards because we weren't sure how to handle the Q&A session at the end of this. So if you haven't, we'll take a few minutes at the end of the presentation before the Q&A to write down any questions you might have, and then we'll pass them in and we'll collect them, and that way we can field any questions without having to worry about like a town hall microphone or whatnot. So, I know some of you do know me. I know Kevin just gave that introduction. Thank you for being here, and I particularly want to thank Dr. Putnam and Tasha Potter and Kevin Marriott and everyone involved with the professional learning and the DEI work here in the district. So those of you that don't know me, and as Kevin shared, I was born and raised in Penfield. I actually grew up in the house over across from the community center with the fire hydrant in the front yard. So I did go to UB, and I've been there ever since. Oddly enough, both my parents are from Buffalo. They came here in the 70s to go to RIT and the U of R, and so that's why I'm from here. But Buffalo is like my ancestral home, I guess. And I've been there ever since. That was my undergraduate my undergraduate degrees were sociology, communication, and history. As Kevin mentioned, I then worked in radio for full-time for about 4.5 years, and then I decided to go back to school for my PhD. These are the main classes that I teach, which is sort of the, well, why is Zaque here, right? Diversity, social research methods, and law and society are the ones I teach most often. And I also worked for a cool office at UB called the Experiential Learning Network, which is headed by the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Research. So while I was at UB, I had a chance to work with all different undergrads from all different disciplines, involved in all different undergraduate research projects while I was at UB full-time for my graduate studies. And as Kevin mentioned in that intro, I work full-time now for the government of Erie County, New York. Involved in everything from the Bills stadium deal to trying to solve the childcare crisis. So that dovetails very much with my research and my interests and my professional experience, and I'm now what's known as ABD in the PhD process, all but dissertation. So if anyone was interested, well, what's he doing with these 2 different hats? That's where I'm at. So let's go over some goals for today. The first is we want to have a better understanding when we walk out of here of what families are and how we think about them. And sometimes those go hand in hand and sometimes they don't. How we think about things often doesn't match up with the world around us and vice versa. So goal number 2, and this is actually a goal, is to have a light bulb moment. I hope that everyone here has at least one sometime during the evening. If you have more, that's awesome. If you don't, if you have none, I needed to try a little harder. But what's also sometimes frustrating is that today might generate more questions than it does answers. In some cases, it's question generating, not question answering. But that's okay, and I hope by the end of it you'll understand why, and maybe that will be the light bulb moment, right? Why do I have more questions than answers now? What's also really important to try and get out of today is this very important word of context. We hear it a lot, we encounter it a lot, sometimes we don't even know what it means. We need context to understand context, right? Everything that we do is situated in some sort of context, whether historical, whether locational, whether cultural, right? There's always that extra layer, sometimes multiple layers, that are involved with how we think about the world, how our experiences are shaped. So we're going to be looking at context specifically related to how we are raised and where we live. And all of this is going to be driven by data and accurate insights. And I will preface this that at some times we might get a little academic-y or wonky, but I hope you can bear with me for whatever slide we're on with that, and then it'll hopefully all make sense just in case you hit one of those spots. That's just a forewarning. I do want to go over some ground rules though, especially during the Q&A session, but also just while you're sitting here, if we hit anything that maybe is new to you, because we all have different familiarities, different understandings, different backgrounds, keep respect and understanding in mind, right? This is a conversation, it's a community conversation. It's designed to provide that illumination and provide context and deeper understanding for things that we encounter every day, but maybe never stop and think about. Related to that is this idea of good discomfort. As a personal aside, I don't know where this idea of learning or new knowledge uptake needs to be the most comfortable, cozy thing that we've ever encountered or ever done, right? There's something important about good discomfort. Those of you that are familiar with cognition or learning science, it's the learning edge or the growth edge, right? Our brains actually take in information better and retain information better when we make our brains do more work, when we step outside of our comfort zone. So that's part of our very important ground rules as we go through all of this today. The other important thing is we're going to use data. I'm going to go through a lot of information here. None of it is designed to be a value judgment. At no point am I sitting here saying, well, I think this, or I'm advocating for this. I'm letting the data and the research do the work, right? I'm just presenting it. But this is peer-reviewed in almost every case. This is information that is at the cutting edge of where social research is right now. So it's not me saying, well, this is what you should do. I am presenting this data-driven research. I will also pick on myself, sometimes to provide an example. I have no problem picking on myself. I have no problem making fun of myself. And it's also the most appropriate, right? It would be kind of odd if I picked someone out of the crowd and said, I'm going to use you as an example. That would be a little strange. So, and then those of you that walked in just a minute ago, we're going to do questions at the end. We're going to do the note cards where you can just write them in, and then we'll collect them, and then we'll field through any of the questions at the end. They're over on that table if you didn't grab them. You can grab them whenever, I don't mind. So, we talked about that all-important word, context. So let's start establishing it. What comes to mind when you hear institution? It's a word we hear a lot. Maybe not a lot, maybe often though. It's not the strangest of words, it's fairly common. Right, oftentimes we think of organizations, right? Institutions are organizations. Organizations are institutions. Maybe when you hear the term institutionalized, you think prisons or the penal or correction system. Colleges and schools are often labeled as institutions, right? Institutions of higher education, institutions of learning. We hear about religious institutions of any type of faith system, right? So those are all institutions, but in my best, infomercial way, but wait, there's more. We're specifically focusing on social institutions. Now, these are those institutions that aren't necessarily a physical thing, a building, a physical space. So this definition from Stanford University is a social institution is an organization, group, or network constructed by people or human activity. That's what makes it a social institution. That is meaningful and influential with some degree of formality and shared understanding, right? That's what makes it an institution. It's not just, oh, we're going about our daily lives. There's some sort of shared understanding or meaning, right, related to this experience, this organization. So that's what makes something a social institution. So in that regard, all these institutions, right, these formal institutions that may have buildings and systems and formal organizations, whether it's the military or business sectors or companies or the family, right, these all fall under that umbrella of social institutions. They don't grow out of the ground, they don't fall out of the sky. We construct them, we organize them, we perpetuate them through our activity and experiences. So this is setting the groundwork for where we're going today. And as you can see, family is underlined because today is about family composition and upbringing. So we're going to use a lot of quotes today. They're important for a reason, or they're just because I like quotes. So family is a social institution, and it's an important one. Well, what do you mean it's important? So family, this is just a definition of it. There's a lot of them that we'll use this definition for today, that family is a group of people typically related by birth, ancestry, marriage, or adoption. And they engage in cooperative behavior and form or maintain socially meaningful relationships. Right? It's important. Who your family is important. It's meaningful. It matters. It's different from your friend group. It's different from your colleagues. So we know this, that families used to be much larger. Just in my example, my grandfather on my dad's side was born in 1918, I believe. Yeah, one of 16. My grandpa on my mom's side, who emigrated from Italy, was one of 10. We know this, just looking around, we know that family sizes are changing. So here we see those quotes again. How we think about a family, how we recognize a family, what falls under that umbrella of family changes, and it's always changed based on historical timeline, or historical time period rather, your geographic location. Right now, a family here versus a family in Brazil, or a family in Australia, or a family in South Korea may look different. So here's those important social functions that we know families play, right? When you're filling out your taxes, how many people are in your household? Do you have dependents? There's lots of other laws related to children and families and parents. You know, being a healthcare proxy, having rights to certain documents. We hear a lot about sort of generational wealth gaps, right? What you can pass on to your children, or what you as children earned from your parents and how that affected your life chances. So we know that this social institution of family is really, really important. I hope everyone's with me right there, right? That wasn't too off the rails. And if it was, it'll make more sense after it gets more complicated. So again, the quotes, what is a family? And that's why that emphasis is there. When you sit there and go, well, I know what a family is. Well, what is it? The one definition is the nuclear family, which you may have heard before. And we're going to use this for our definition of the nuclear family. It's the family that's defined by parents and children, biological or adoptive. That's sort of the simplest way to comprehend what a nuclear family is. Then there's also an extended family, which again, we hear that. Okay, well, what's an extended family? How many cousins does it entail? Is it your aunts and uncles? Is it second cousins? So it's a little more flexible than a nuclear family. Typically, it's defined as you and up to your grandparents, or if your grandparents, down to your grandchildren, and siblings and parents and their children, right? So aunts and uncles and maybe cousins, first-ring cousins. That's what the common sort of social scientific definition of extended family is. More quotes. It's all that emphasis on the syllables. Traditional is intentionally in quotes because we are going to engage with two definitions of traditional, or two meanings of traditional today. One of them is way more important, though. This is our contemporary sense of traditional. And this might be what comes to mind when you hear the word family, right? It's a nuclear family. We're not talking about an extended family. When I hear family, I often think, yeah, mom, dad, probably married, some kids, the classic 2.5 kids. In the United States, this is what usually comes to mind when we're talking about family or when we're thinking about families, right? We think about the traditional nuclear family. And again, that's here in the US and in a Western context. This is not necessarily universal across the globe or at all moments in history. So it may seem counterintuitive, but this is the contemporary usage, the contemporary sense of traditional. Maybe this picture comes to mind, right? When I say think of a family. And as a 31-year-old who is the son of late 60s, early 70s parents, I can tell you there has never been a family selfie that is that cheerful and that easy to organize and that idyllic. It's usually a lot of yelling and who takes better photos. This picture was the first thing that came up. I just Googled family. That's the first image that showed up. Maybe that's the first image that came to your mind or something similar. I then went a step further and said, okay, let's reduce it down to some childish silliness. I typed in family stick figures. That was the first thing that came up. So while you're sitting here, even though we're only 20-some minutes into this, how might this not be accurate? Or where might there be some gaps when we're talking about families? And also, in all honesty, the boy, I wish all of my family selfies looked that fun and happy was not actually the first picture, it was the second one. For some reason, that was the first picture in Google when you typed in family, which then I clicked on, and that is the image on the Wikipedia page for dysfunctional family, which I'm not sure why. That silhouette like they're about to drop an album. So I lied. The selfie one was the second image in Google. So we talked about the traditional nuclear family, right? The contemporary idea of the traditional family here in the United States. The other sense of traditional, which we're not going to use a ton, but when you hear traditional related to this type of family, think traditional as in old, right? A lot of mutton chops, a lot of big families, a lot of like outdated stuff. That type of traditional. Because sometimes when you hear people talk about the traditional family, they're talking about how things used to be. My grandparents, right? The gigantic families, children of immigrants, having to go to work instead of school, selling, papers on their paper route. That's a different type of traditional. It's still a traditional type of family, but that's more of the historical type of traditional. But what's important here is in the United States, that historical sense of traditional families were larger and were more likely to be multi-generational, right? More than just the parents and the immediate children living in that family. So again, that's traditional in a historical US sense, but that might not be universal currently across the globe. Clear for everyone. We are mainly going to be talking about the contemporary sense of traditional throughout today. So I'm going to play this video. It's 5 minutes. It's from The Atlantic. This is from 2020. David Brooks is one of their contributing columnists. I think he's a contributing editor too. And this is going to really break down some data and some historical context as it relates to families in the United States. Start that again. There we go.
It's an image that has been etched in our minds. A family is a married couple with 2.5 kids.
Oh, great, Dad.
Yeah, oh, great, Dad.
But today, only a minority of American families are traditional 2-parent nuclear families.
We're in a moment of cultural lag. We have an old, archaic idea of what family is. It existed in this one freakish moment of history between 1950 and 1965.
So how did the nuclear family fail? And what do modern families actually look like? This is David Brooks. He wrote this Atlantic cover story about the history of the family in America.
Through most of history, family was an economic unit. It was for making the farm work.
In 1800, 75% of American workers were farmers, and most of the other 25% worked in small family businesses. In the South, of course, slavery separated many black families. But across most of society, people lived in big, extended families.
There were uncles, nieces, nephews around. If a relationship failed, if somebody died, there were plenty of other people to pick up the slack.
During the Victorian era, the family reached its peak in the US and Britain.
I hope you are behaving very well.
The number of people who lived in extended families was higher in the Victorian era than ever before or ever since. The world that people had known was falling away. And they felt not only economically under threat, they felt morally under threat.
So the extended family functioned as a moral unit. In it, children were taught right from wrong, and traditional values were preserved. Then, as factories opened in big U.S. cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, young people left home to chase the American dream. The families they started were nuclear families. By 1960, the nuclear family dominated. Nearly 78% of children were living in one.
You had what they called a cult of togetherness. So there was tremendous social pressure to live in one of these nuclear families.
But the conditions for its success were very particular to the post-war era.
Everything conspired to make the nuclear family stable and possible. Wages went way up, so you had men who could have a single earning household. Women were relegated to household. You had high union membership, high church attendance, high social trust.
These independent people spend the profit from their labor to maintain the highest standard of living in the nation.
By 1965, that was over. And the stable, cultish nuclear families of the 1950s have been replaced by the distressed families of every decade since.
Over the past half-century, the share of people living alone in America has doubled. People are marrying later and divorcing more. The general fertility rate is dropping. And the stress from this change has fallen disproportionately on less affluent households who must perform all the work that was once done by members of an extended family. This burden isn't evenly distributed. Women still spend significantly more time on housework and childcare, according to recent data.
Affluent people can afford to buy extended family. So the switch from an extended family to a detached nuclear family has been great for those who are privileged. It's given us way more freedom. It's been sometimes cataclysmic for those who aren't.
But around the globe, 38% of people still live in extended family units.
In Gambia, the average household size is 13.7 people.
In Mexico, many live within kinship groups of up to 70 people. There are disadvantages to the extended families of the past.
Sometimes you're never alone, you don't get a lot of privacy. And in the old days, one of the disadvantages of extended family, the women were stuck in the kitchen cooking for 25 people. And so they have real downsides. The most interesting trend of the past few decades is the creation of chosen families. And this phenomenon really came to prominence in the 1980s in San Francisco in the gay and lesbian community. People who have been cast adrift by the breakdown of the nuclear family, they've lost touch with one or both parents, and they're sort of floating, and they come together and say, you know, we'll be a family together.
A chosen family can help to share the challenges and the rewards of modern life, and make it more equitable.
We need to extend love to others. And if we don't have a chance to do that, something goes really wrong. A family is a place where you offer care, you offer unconditional love. The bond between you is no longer transactional, it's no longer even voluntary. And we're seeing that spread not just in biological ways, but in non-biological ways too. It's one of the more hopeful things I see in society. Hi.
So one of the lines that jumps out the most to me from that video is how, in a modern sense, those who have the means can buy an extended family, right? Can buy the resources that those traditional extended families used to fill. We think about how expensive childcare is and how hard it is to find time and the resources with both parents working to take care of basic things around the house and to take care of your children, right? That's just me. That's something that jumped out to me from that video, and I really like that one. So, David Brooks summed it up really well. Our contemporary idea of the traditional family is really, really biased. It is based on the US, right? It's not even taking into account the rest of the globe. Post-World War II, white, middle-class, suburban Judeo-Christian ideal. Those pictures, those stick figure pictures of what a family is that Google churned out, right? Even those are biased and conditioned by this, as David Brooks said, freakish moment in time, 2 or 3 decades after World War II. And that's even more so here in the Northeast, right? The sort of classic Rust Belt area, which is predominantly white, predominantly Christian. Right here in Penfield, majority white, majority Christian. In the Northeast, a suburb, we have these sort of really entrenched assumptions or ideas or snap thoughts of what a family is or what a family looks like. So, the traditional, that contemporary sense of traditional American family is in the minority. Less than half of US families are made up of 2 opposite-sex parents in their first marriage with children from that marriage. Think about that. We know divorce rates have been climbing decade after decade, right? So even the sense of you might be in a family situation with 2 opposite-sex parents who are married, are you a member of that family while they're on their second marriage or their third marriage? That's why there's so much messiness and nuance to even this idea of traditional. There's also something known as the heteronormative assumption, right? Which is we go through life oftentimes thinking straight relationships, opposite-sex partners, are the sort of default or the norm. In 2016, almost 17% of parents, right, couples with children, were same-sex partners. We have another video that's also going to shine some light on how the modern family is sort of changing. This is from Pew Research, which is a great nonpartisan, they call themselves a fact tank. They're arguably the gold standard for non-academic research, right? So research that wasn't conducted at or by a university. This video is from 2014, plays on some similar things that David Brooks talked about, but also adds some new insights.
For baby boomers, weddings were a rite of passage and the first step toward starting a family. Back in 1960, 6 out of every 10 Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 tied the knot. Today's weddings may look different. You can thank YouTube for that. But the real story is that they are happening less and less frequently. In fact, 44% of millennials and 39% of all Americans now say that marriage is becoming obsolete.
Marriage as an institution is losing its customer base, if you will. You go back a half a century and 72% of all adults over the age of 18 were married. Today, 51% of all adults are married.
Since 1960, the median age at first marriage has risen by 7 years for women and 6 years for men. And while young people may have cooled on marriage, they haven't stopped having babies.
There are many things at play here. One is that people are marrying later, and some people are foregoing marriage altogether, but they haven't stopped having children, so more people are having children outside of marriage. In 2010, I think about 4 in 10 babies were born to unmarried mothers, and that's up from about 5% in 1960.
It is a change that is widespread. Among whites, the share of births to unmarried women rose to 29% by 2011. Among Hispanics, 53%. And for blacks, 72%.
When you look back at over the last 50 years and you think about the typical nuclear family of a married mother and father raising their own children, that is not the norm anymore. Fewer than 1 in 4 households look like that. There's cohabitation, there's divorce, there's remarriage, there's just this whole sort of plethora of different arrangements now. And the family just looks a lot different now than it did 50 years ago.
So Kim Parker, I've done a little bit of work with before, and she is just fantastic. And one of the many reasons I plug Pew Research. And those of you that are teachers, if you're looking for really digestible research and trends and all of that good stuff, Pew is great because they put everything in super accessible, everyday person language, and then they always put the link to like the super nerdy stuff. So I would just encourage anyone, if you ever want to find out anything about any sort of social or economic or cultural trend in the United States, head on over to Pew. So this is, I'm sorry if it's a little difficult to see, this is from 2020. It's a combination of census data and a think tank known as the Population Reference Bureau. This note down here is family households. They define family households as a household with one person and an additional person that is related in that household, right? They're somehow related through marriage, birth, or adoption. So that's their definition of family households, because you might be saying, Zach, what are you talking about? That's at 65%. But when you take into account how they operationalize that data, that's not the case. What we want to look at is married couples with children. 19% across the United States. 19% are that two parents with kids household. And we sit here and think, oh, family, it's two parents and 2.5 kids, and they're living in their white picket fence house, right? That's not the case. That is, as David Brooks said, a freakish moment in history that we keep latching onto. And as people who are educators or that work with all different types of populations, we really need to think about, right? What is the data telling us? What is the population we're engaging with? What is going on with the people that we work with their families, especially if we're working with children, right? Not every household looks like that sort of idyllic traditional family. Not only not every, but across the United States, a dramatic minority is that traditional two-parent family. So what do we mean by non-traditional then? Well, it's sort of the everything else, right? It's any family arrangement that is different from our contemporary definition of traditional. And the list goes on. You heard Kim Parker mention cohabitation, right? That is very common, particularly in millennial cohorts, right? We live together, we're partners, we're not married, we have kids. Very, very common, especially when you look by generation cohort. Families with same-sex parents, we showed it before. In 2016, it was like 16.5% of parents were same-sex parents. Even adopting children, right? That can put a wrinkle, that can put an asterisk into our idea of adoption. Single-parent adoption of a child is on the rise. So that's why this and more is there. Anything that sort of blows up that traditional contemporary idea of what a family is would fall under our non-traditional definition. So this is also from Pew. I know the font's a little small to read, but this again is just a graphical representation. This is from 2014 as well, that shows two parents are on the decline. Now this does not specify two married parents or two opposite-sex parents. It's just two parents, period, in a household. So that even shows how this idea of, oh, we talk about a two-parent household, that comes with an asterisk. Doesn't mean they're opposite-sex partners, doesn't mean they're married necessarily, doesn't mean it's their first marriage. There's a lot of different ways that families are made up and composed. So let's look outside the US. Overall, fertility, which I'll talk about what exactly we mean by fertility in a second. Overall, the rate at which new babies are being born is dropping. Our global population is still rising, but that's probably going to level out in the next handful of decades. By 2070 is sort of the estimate. So on average, family size is decreasing. So when you hear this word fertility in a demographic sense, so by the way, demography is a subdiscipline of sociology. So anytime you see anything that has to do with population change or demographics, that's our wheelhouse. So fertility is typically reported as the average number of births per woman, or it can be the births per couple, right? We all know about the birds and the bees, so it takes two to tango. But most commonly, it is counted as births per woman. This is where you get the point children, right? There aren't decimals of children hanging around anywhere. It's the average number of births per woman. And for what it's worth, you would need 2.1 is considered the replacement number, right? So it's not just 2 people per mother and father per couple. You technically would need slightly across the world or across the country, right, on average, slightly more than 2 to make up for people that die. So that's why 2.1 is technically considered the replacement rate. If everyone, on average, if every mother had 2.1 children over the course of her life, our population would remain flat. But this varies by region, by culture, by country, and we're going to look at that. This is from the United Nations. From 2015, so a little old on the numbers. But you can see these regions, which they don't do them necessarily by country, whereas one, like Northern America, not North America, but Northern America. We said 2.1 is needed to keep the population flat. Well, here in Northern America, which I believe is the US and Canada, we're at 1.9. So just people having kids is going to lead over time to a declining population. The only reason the US's population is growing is because of immigration. And you see that similarly across Europe. You see this in the advanced industrialized Asian countries, Korea, Japan, declining populations because people just aren't having as many kids. As that Pew video showed, they are still having kids, but in many different ways. It's not mom and dad, 2 kids, 2.5 kids, whatever you want to average it out to. The ways in which families are taking shape is changing globally, not just in the US, but globally. So, what are some key takeaways from all this? Well, our idea of family, again, the quotes come back, the traditional contemporary sense of family is inaccurate, flat out, full stop, period. And family composition has changed over time. We talked about how there's that older idea of traditional. David Brooks in his video mentioned, yes, there used to be these big extended families. Just here in the US and in Western countries like the United Kingdom, that has changed. And it continues, right, to look different even now. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach to this idea of family. The other thing is that here in the US and in many other industrialized countries, the family size is shrinking. It is not uncommon to have 1 child or to be married and have no kids. So how does that play into something like schools or social services, which I work with a lot? These family-centered institutions, these institutions that engage with children and dependents, right? How does this change our thinking if our idea of family and the size of our families is shifting? And we saw that. Not only is the traditional family inaccurate, it is a tremendous statistical minority. So where do we go from here? We talked about families a lot. And if families are a bit of a misconception, right? If our idea, our assumptions about families and how families are composed are less than accurate, what other misconceptions might we have? I'm going to answer that with another question. What else impacts our upbringing and how we're raised and how we grow up Is it just family? We're here in a school auditorium. I would bet teachers and administrators would say, no, it's not just family. There's a lot that goes into how children, mature and go through the world and enter into adulthood. What about all of these? Not just schools. What about where you're from, where you live? What region of a country or the world you're in? What about your culture? Growing up in Penfield is probably very different than growing up in, say, the Southwest, like New Mexico or Arizona. So this list could go on and on. So what we're going to talk about here in the upbringing component is place. I lost my other clicker. That's okay. So place is more than just a physical location, right? Places and spaces have meaning. And here's one silly example. I am in an auditorium giving a presentation, right? If I was here in a bathing suit and a tank top that said "Sun's out, guns out," it would look a little weird. But if I was at the beach, that wouldn't look very weird. It would probably be some of the least shocking attire that you would see at a beach, right? So we know that by my being on stage in an auditorium giving a presentation, it would be odd if I was in a bathing suit and a tank top, but not at the beach, because these spaces carry meaning, they carry influence, they carry an understanding, right? Just by being here, we know basic etiquette of what you do in a theater or an auditorium. So here's a thought. Rochester and Albany are about 200 miles apart, right? Cuba and Florida are about 95 miles apart. Which two would you say are more similar? And if you sort of noodle on that for a second, why would you say that? Is distance the only thing that matters here? Is being in the same state the most important part? Being within the same country? Singapore and Hong Kong, both former imperial possessions of Great Britain, both very geographically small, both in Southeast Asia, both speak a mix of English and Cantonese, and Singapore also speaks, I'm drawing a blank. I apologize for that. I just know this mainly because UB has a campus in Singapore, so we interact with a lot of Singaporean students. Malay, thank you, I knew it would come to me. So are Singapore and Hong Kong the same? They have similar histories, they're in similar parts of the world, but I think we could argue that no, they are very different. And if you talk to someone who is Singaporean or from Hong Kong, they would say, no, we are very different. So place matters. Here's another thought exercise. What makes Penfield, Penfield? Is it the identity? Is it the spirit and pride? Penfield Patriots, red, black, and white. Is there shared values and shared culture? Would we even sit here and think, does Penfield have culture? Oftentimes we think about whole countries or whole regions as cultural. Is there sort of a micro-culture within Penfield? How and why is Penfield different from Webster? Or dare I say Fairport? Or East Rochester? And this is a personal dig because my senior year, this auditorium was a giant pit in the ground and we had no football field and we had to play all our home games over at East Rochester. But I've totally gotten over that. But seriously, what makes Penfield, Penfield? Geographically speaking, where'd it go? Penfield's about 10 miles across, east to west. From Penfield High School to East Rochester High School, it's 3 miles. But if you went from here to East Rochester High School, you would somehow know you're in a different place. But if I went from, down, I don't know, sort of coming close to the Baytown area out to more like Salt Road, Walworth area, you'd still say, oh no, it's Penfield, right? But it's farther. Why is that? So we're going to go to the data here. All of this is pulled from the US Census, and for those of you looking for publicly accessible and digestible census data, 2 great websites are datausa.io and censusreporter.org. Super easy to work with and very intuitive with their data visualizations. Okay, so I apologize, this is sort of tough to read. I'll be scrolling. There's only so much you could do. There's no way it would fit on one sheet. I have both town of Penfield and the Penfield School District up here. And one other caveat. When we are talking the Penfield School District, here, we'll go. There's the town of Penfield, right? Can you all see that? Looks sort of, right? The town looks like Pennsylvania, sort of. When we are talking the Penfield School District, we're talking about the squiggly actual district. We're not talking about the actual population of students. This data is all of the people that live within the district, whether or not they're students. So that's why if you see 30-some thousand, you're not going to be like, there's not 30,000 students that go to Penfield. No, but these are people that live within the geographic boundaries of the district. And here, this is Census Reporter, one of those websites I told you about. So, I'm going to have to scroll here, see if I can scroll and walk. We have the town of Penfield, Penfield School District, and for comparison purposes, Monroe County, New York State, and the US overall. All of this is from 2020 census data. They do have what are called the American Community Survey estimates, which are more up to date, but significantly less reliable than going with the decennial censuses, right? 2000, 2010, 2020. So to compare apples to apples, we're using the 2020 census. Anytime there's an X, it's just in the school district. School district data is harder to get. It's just I couldn't find something that was a perfect comparison. So can everyone see the mouse hovering there? We're gonna use that. So as you can see, both the town of Penfield and the Penfield School District area have similar populations in terms of size, but the town of Penfield, almost at 40,000, whereas the school district's at 30. You can see here, across the board, the United States and all of these different geographic areas are majority female. That's very, very common. Part of it's because females have longer life expectancy than men on average. Right, but the US is just slightly more female. New York State's 51%, Monroe County is 51%, almost 52%, Penfield School District 54%, and the town of Penfield 53%. You'll also see that both the town and school district are older proportionally than the county, the state, and the country. Keep that in mind when we're talking about, again, where does this idea of traditional family come from? Maybe it's tied to a simple demographic fact. We have more older people in Penfield, both the town and the district, than the county, the state, and the country. Looking at race and ethnicity, Penfield School District, again, people that live within the boundaries of the school district, 88% white. Compared to the town, 91%. Noticeably higher than New York State overall, but also higher than the rest of Monroe County and the US overall. So the reason there are two categories for Hispanic or Latino and Latina is because these are ethnic identities, not racial identities. So people can answer on the census, oh, it's a microphone. I am white but Hispanic, or black but Hispanic. So this is why also I could find it in the normal census, but for the school district I couldn't find one, as people who identified as white, but specifically white, not Hispanic or Latino or Latina. Going down to our households. Right, Penfield is a town, 80% owner occupied. A lot of household owners. Home ownership is very high in the town and within the district at 79%. However, you see Monroe County and the US are similar, and New York State overall is at about 54% home ownership. Obviously, that is skewed heavily by New York City and downstate. There's a lot of renters, but there are renters, people who rent within Penfield, and specifically looking at the town of Penfield. Which, picking on myself, I remember growing up here thinking, oh, no one rents in Penfield, everyone has a house. That was my own blind spot growing up here, just because my context was I lived in a house that I knew my parents owned. So again, when we're thinking about what makes up our population here, what makes up those that are students and their families here within the Penfield School District or the town of Penfield, right? People do rent. 83% own. So that means the other 17% rent. You also see, right, languages other than English that are spoken at home, 8.3 for the town, 7% for the school district. Lower than the rest of the county, the state, and the country. Finally, looking at work, education, and employment. Within the school district boundaries, 57% have a bachelor's degree or higher. That is dramatically higher than the county, the state, and the country. Also looking at median household income within the district, $82,000 and change, 93, almost 94 within the town of Penfield, dramatically higher than the county, the state, and the US overall. Also within the district boundaries, 6% of that 30-some thousand living within the boundaries that make up the Penfield School District, 6% are below the poverty line. So even though Penfield is, by the numbers, more affluent, there are persons living within both the town and the school district boundaries below the poverty line. So we can go back to this. I'll also pull this back up during Q&A if anyone wants to see any more. I know there's just a lot here and it's hard to put on a projector. So what does all this mean? I'm going to pull from one of my favorite academic dudes. His name's Tobler, Dr. Waldo Tobler, which to me is like the perfect name for a geography professor who probably has like elbow patches and stuff. But something known as Tobler's Law, it's technically his first law, but when people say Tobler's Law, they usually mean his first law. Everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. Seems a little confusing. Here's his second law if anyone cares. But if you ever in your life encounter Tobler's Law, they usually mean the first one. So the second law, right, is what happens outside of an area affects what goes on in it. What does he mean by this? That last bullet point's important. What Tobler is saying is that over time, it's not a snap instantaneous thing, but over time, people, processes, our geographic, economic, demographic patterns, we tend to cluster. We tend to hang out by people and places and things that are more similar to us. And because of that, we're often blinded. We have blind spots because near things are more related than distant things. I go to Penfield High School. The school district's 88% white. I am more likely to see people that are like me than if I go somewhere else in Monroe County or somewhere else in New York State, right? So the data back that up, and this law of geography backs it up. We tend to cluster around things that are similar and people that are similar. Teasing out more of the social and societal effects. Mark Galanter, he was a law professor at Wisconsin. I think he just retired. But his most influential work was actually published in the 70s when he was a young professor at UB Law School. He wrote this really impactful, it was originally a law review article, and then he expanded it into a book. You're familiar with the terms the haves and the have-nots, right? When we're talking about sort of wealth inequality and generational poverty and transmission of advantage and disadvantage, right? A lot of talk about the haves and the have-nots. So what Galanter wrote about, he really flipped the script in how we think about people that are similar and different and how this sort of social transmission of similarity or dissimilarity happens. He emphasized it's not just about the have-nots, his words, not mine, continually falling behind or unable to get ahead. It's also about how the haves continually come out ahead. They keep coming out ahead, and that it's actually easier if you trace sort of the pathways of economics and socioeconomic and educational advantage. It's much, much easier for the, quote, haves to keep coming out on top, and it takes a ton of work and effort for the have-nots to ever make a dent. And that's what we should be focusing on. That's what Galanter argues. So maybe you've heard these terms before, right? This is sort of the underlying theme related to cumulative advantage and disadvantage. So if you've heard this term and don't actually know what it means in the nitty-gritty, cumulative advantage is simply that. Over time, social and economic boosts that you have, they compound, right? If you start off in a higher socioeconomic status family or community, on average, not absolute, but on average, you're able to do better, go further. I will pick on myself. I come from Penfield. Both my parents are college educated. My mother is highly college educated. Both of them worked white-collar, professional jobs. I came to this school, I told you where I lived. I am now in a PhD program, I work in policy for the government, I teach, I work in radio, I'm doing okay, right? What would my chances be like if that wasn't the household or the family situation or the community situation I came from? The flip side is cumulative disadvantage, right? That over time, those social or economic penalties that we incur, by no fault of our own other than luck of the draw or where we're born or where we live, those penalties compound over time. It is that much harder to move up the socioeconomic ladder. It is that much harder to get ahead. And it will be that much harder, on average, for your children to get ahead. So that's why place matters. That's why place and community and location intersects with family composition. So what are some insights from this? Both the town and the school district of Penfield are predominantly white, higher income than Monroe County, New York State, and the US, older than Monroe County, New York State, and the US, less racially and ethnically diverse than the county, state, and the country, and majority female, just like all those other sort of demographic areas or geographic areas. But this is also true, right? Two things can be true at the same time. So everything here is town and then school district, right? 4% in the town, 6% in the school district are below the poverty line. About 7% each are foreign born, 4 to 5% are Hispanic or of Latino or Latina descent, 3 to 4% are Asian, 2 to 3% are black. That means even though these first bullet points are true, these are also true. Penfield is not a monolith. It is not 100% of anything. There are members of this community, both the school district and the town, who don't match those majority demographic categories, right? So to me, what jumps out here is, wow, imagine if you're a member of one of those communities that isn't in the numeric majority. Or myself, what about my peers, my friends, my classmates, my neighbors, who are in one of these categories? Do I stop and think about it? Do I ever think about, wow, their experience must be really different than mine? Or how is it different than mine? Right? So even though Tobler's law holds true on all of these categories, it doesn't mean it's universal. It's not monolithic. There is variation. There are people in this community, whether it's the town or the school district, who are different, just simply based on demographic numbers. But because of Tobler's law, because we love as people to cluster around things that are similar to us, we often forget about that. We often go through with blinders on. So finally, things just to keep in mind. We started out talking about family. So how has our idea of family changed? When you think about yourself, right? Do you meet the traditional definition of family? Your kids? I don't know about me. My parents separated when I was 10, divorced at some point, got back together, then didn't like 8 different times. So would that count as traditional? Or is that traditional with an asterisk? We know that family sizes are shrinking in the US and globally. So the idea of big families or even families with more than one kid or any kid, that may not be the norm or expectation. So how does your family or where you were raised, where you lived, how you were raised, the people around you, how does that shape your understanding of the world around you every day? And finally, does your town, does your neighborhood, does your community impact or influence the ways you think about all those people around you? Or are you going to start thinking about that maybe just a little bit more now? Right? And how might these ideas, these assumptions, be a little inaccurate or a misconception? I told you, more questions than answers. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Then there's places that I think are way more diverse, maybe like Henrietta, Greece. Is there one that has a better impact on life, quality of life, for example? With more diverse communities or more homogenous communities?
Right, that's a really good question. So I'm going to defer back to what I said earlier, right? Like value judgments can be a really messy thing to get into because of the subjectivity, right? So how do we define better, right? Like that's sort of the tricky part of that question. The other thought is, let's zoom the lens out. Comparing, you mentioned like Rush Henrietta, Penfield, the city. How would things look maybe in sort of another mid-size, smallish metro like, I don't know, Baltimore or Fresno, California, right? Like sometimes to get to your question of who has better life chances, it's actually better to take more of a shotgun sample and look at that over time than just looking at, within Monroe County or within the upstate or Western New York community. Because if you get a broader and wider sample, you get better representation of like tracking those demographic life course outcomes. So that is a whole field of research is life course sociology, which does exactly that, like tracking outcomes over a lifetime. The other question is, or the other thought to your question is, you run into the potential not just of like everyday bias, but you run into the potential of statistical bias because a community like Penfield is so disproportionately white, right? Like the other categories, the other demographic categories wouldn't have enough statistical power. So you might say, well, look, Penfield's got great life chances or whatever, but the fact of the matter is your statistical model is just saying, well, yeah, everyone in Penfield's white, right? Or the other form of bias is that we are biasing whiteness, right? Through a myriad of different factors that sort of define living and growing up in this type of manner is putting your thumb on the scale in a good way, right? Like by default, we've got decades and decades and decades of systems that have established this as a good school, quote, a good town, quote. So it's sort of, you run, the one case is you would bias your models, your life course models because of the high proportion white. The other one is you would have a confounding factor of, well, what are we counting as a good chance, right? Like graduating school and going to college and being able to, live economically successful. It would be hard to parse that out if you're looking at Rush Henrietta, Penfield, and the city without bumping into that issue of like, well, what counts as good?
I asked that something that's always bugged me a lot.
Yeah.
I grew up in the city, but when you ask people, take away the city school district about quote unquote good districts, bad districts, right. Monroe County, people tend to say the east side districts, right. And the bad districts tend to be the west side districts, right. All of which have like a 95% graduation rate. Right. But there's other common denominators for factors themselves, other factors I think that people consider that they don't say out loud, right? Sure. For why they might think that East Athena isn't quite as good as West Thomas. Right. Even though that those performance indicators say the same thing.
Right. Well, that comes back to how you're measuring good, right? Is it simply graduation rates? And the other thing is, so my mom retired from Greece as an assistant principal. Greece, and if you're familiar with the Buffalo area, the Erie County where I work and live, Cheektowaga and Greece are very similar. Very big first-ring suburbs. What we actually see, not just regionally and locally here, but actually across the country, is with the sort of trendiness of re-urbanization, right? Back to the city, which has really taken off since 2008, 2012. You're actually seeing a huge shift in non-white and lower income residents to those first-ring historic suburbs. The other thing with Greece is it's got more of that industrial heritage from Kodak being right over there. So to your point about the assumption is like, oh, the east side's got good schools and the west side, like, pick whatever joke you want to make out of a hat about the west side schools. Oftentimes, the way we sort of conceptualize good or bad comes back to what I just said. The idea is it's less white and lower average household income, therefore it's bad, even if they graduate just at the same rates. Right, so that's one of those assumption checks, like, what is it that we, whoever we are, what is it that makes us think something is good or bad? And that's really hard and sort of discomforting sometimes to think about. But that goes back to that good discomfort I talked about in the beginning, that we actually learn and grow as people and as thinkers when we have these kinds of conversations that are like, yeah, if they graduate the same, why do people think West Side schools are, quote, bad and East Side schools are, quote, good? Very good question. Sorry, it was a really long, complicated answer. Or not an answer. Thank you. How do we take, okay, first question, how do we break down the contemporary perspective of the traditional family? Ooh, I don't know. I told you I don't have a lot of solutions, unfortunately. I think if I had to venture a guess, I would say exposure. I would say encouraging yourself or your children or your friends and family to venture into spaces that are not clustered around similarity. Here's an example. Again, I'll pick on myself. Growing up in Penfield, there was this unspoken assumption that, like, the city was just dangerous or bad. Like, no one said it. It was never said. But it was always, like, implied, like, oh, you're going to the city. Yeah. But, you know, 13, 15, whatever, 17-year-old me didn't stop to think about that. And think of how that's reproduced in so many different little ways in our everyday life. Another huge component is language, right? Language is how we think. It's how we paint pictures and internalize ideas, right? The best example you can think about is if you have a dream, you have to retell it either to someone else or to yourself. Even if you are the one who had the dream, you have to retell it to yourself in language. So going back to the city example, what comes to mind when you hear the phrase inner city? Now keep in mind, the inner city is not actually a definition of a geographic space. It's not downtown, right? That's different than the inner city, but wouldn't downtown be the inner city geographically? When we think about the neighborhoods or areas of Rochester or Buffalo, where people often stigmatize or assume, you know, high crime, it's one of those bad neighborhoods. They're often not in the, quote, inner city. They're often on the sort of sides of the city, the exterior of the city. But that word, that term, inner city, immediately puts a picture in our mind and puts a picture in other people's minds. So when we're talking about breaking down the sort of contemporary traditional idea of family, language matters, right? Language is how we paint those pictures to ourselves and to others. So, you know, in your daily occurrences or interactions, you know, just think about how you're discussing or talking about what a family is. You know, saying things like your parents instead of mom and dad, right? Like little minor things like that actually go a long way in sort of changing narratives and collective conversations. Okay, that was a good question. What else we got? When you say our idea of the family is inaccurate, who is our? Do members of the more okay, hang on, sorry. I'll take this one at a time. When you say our idea of the American family is inaccurate, who is our? I am using a broad brushstroke of sort of American society writ large, right? So it's intentionally not specific by using an overly broad brushstroke that probably that not probably is definitely not taking into account all the differences within American society, which is the whole point of it. That's why it's a misconception, because it doesn't take into account the variation and the differences. Second part of this question, do members of the more accurate expanded concept of family share the inaccurate idea of family? I don't know, but I would assume sure. I mean, that would require getting into 330 million different heads. But oftentimes, members of minority groups, and I don't mean minority, it doesn't even need to be a statistical minority, right? But like the non-dominant or non-majority assumption group often filter their life through the lens of that majority, right? Here's a perfect example. We know females make up 51 to 52% of just about everywhere, if not more. Yet we know men and males are typically the, quote, top of the pyramid, top of the ladder group. Why is that? They're in the statistical minority. But people that aren't in those sort of top of the ladder groups often filter their life and their experiences through that lens. Why do you think nuclear family is continually perpetuated as the normal family? I don't know. I think because culture and media and really entrenched sort of assumptions and norms and expectations are hard to get rid of. I think that's just, we can go through history and look at when statistically or numerically things change, but we still hang on to these antiquated ideas. It's not just family, it's very hard for societies to change and update their views and thinking to match reality. And that's also not exclusive to the US, right? You can go to many different countries, cultures, regions, time periods, and change takes time. And change, oftentimes people's realities don't match their assumptions. How, as a community, do we help all of our members to understand that we do have members who are in the minority and may not always feel valued because we have so many biases that may negatively impact our treatment of others? How, as a community, do we help all of our members to understand that we do have members who are in the minority and may not always feel valued because we have so many biases that may negatively impact our treatment of others? Boy, I wish I had an answer for that one. I think it goes back to my prior comment. Language and small practices go a long way. What starts with sort of an intentional practice, effort, word choice, behavioral choice, you do it with enough repetition, it becomes second nature, it becomes a habit. And if enough people start doing that, right, you would hope organizationally or communally, it might start to shift the overall practice or the overall sort of community context. I don't have an answer for that one, unfortunately. I wish I did, right? That would be like a magic wand moment. But I do think language, intentionality, incremental change is okay. It can be frustrating. It can absolutely be frustrating. We do want that magic wand in a lot of cases. But that's why it's a magic wand, not a real wand. And I think if enough people start doing those incremental, intentional, that then become habitual changes, other people pick up on that too, right? Like if one person starts and then 3 people start and then another person goes, oh, right? Like we understand this is what we're going to do to make sure we're not dominating the conversation or excluding other people's thoughts or perspectives. Or we're going to make sure we don't speak in such manner, or we do speak in another way. That adds up. I really believe that, and I've witnessed that in many different situations. But it is incremental, and it does take time. David, okay, so I apologize. This is a question about David Brooks saying it was a freakish moment in history between 1950 and 1965 or whatever. Or other researchers, and David Brooks, keep in mind, he is a journalist, he's not a researcher. But The Atlantic is probably one of the best researched popular press articles, or popular press outlets. I latched on to freakish because I just thought it was a funny way to describe that it was a sort of snapshot in time. It's freakish in the sense that it's really a historical anomaly, right? The 3 decades after World War II are not the entirety or the totality or anywhere near the entire existence of the United States as a country. Not even taking into account the existence here on the North American continent before the US was a country, and doesn't take into account the entire totality of human history. So that's another thing that people writ large have a habit of doing, but we seem to do very well in the US, is we latch on to those really popularized sort of pinnacle moments in history and pop culture and act like that's sort of the baseline or the norm. That's not. I mean, it's 2 to 3 decades. Like, that is not a long amount of time or a long period of time. An example I think about is, it seems like it would be a ridiculous amount of effort and some sort of ahistorical random fact if we ever added more than 50 states. But in both my parents' lifetimes, we had 48 states, right? But like, we have in our brain, nope, US has 50 states, that's it, and it would be ridiculous and unheard of, and we'd have to wind back the timeline to think about before having 50 states. No, it was 1959, we added Alaska and Hawaii. So similarly with the family, like, we've latched on to that idea of, you know, leave it to Beaver or whatever, and we have a hard time moving past that. So I think when David Brooks says it was freakish, it was an anomaly. It was a blip on the historical radar that, similar to some of the other questions, we just have a really hard time moving past. That's all the written questions, I think. I think that's all of them. Any other, I'll field any other sort of questions, if you have any. No? I'll hang around though, so if you want to ask one-on-one, I'd be more than happy to. And also, if you have anything that comes to mind, if you want to get them to Tasha or Kevin, you know, if a week from now or whatever you go, oh, I had a thought on this, they can email me, that would work too. Okay, thank you very much.